This first one is going to be a fantastic overview, and it's led by Dr. Carl Castro, who not only serves as the chairman of the NATO Workgroup on Transition, of which we have all of our colleagues here representing that great group, but also as the director for the University of Southern California's Military and Veteran Family Research Institute. And they, as you know, as I mentioned, Los Angeles, where University of Southern California is, their research and their programs, don't just apply to Los Angeles, but one of their key programs does. And like I said, it's very challenging in a population that's over 400,000 veterans in one city. So his experience is going to be very unique and very good contribution as he moderates the rest of the panel. So I want to say thank you very much for Dr. Castro and your colleagues for joining us, and thanks for coming to Ukraine.
So, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and John, thank you so much for inviting me. I am going to really try to keep my talk focused on what we are working on as a NATO group, and I'll talk about that. But, one of the things that's not in the bio, I'm also a retired Army colonel. And one of the things that you always had to do when you gave presentations, when I was a military officer, I always had to do disclaimers that anything I say is, I'm not speaking for the Department of Defense, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now as a professor, I don't have to have that disclaimer. However, I'm also not speaking for anybody either. I will make some comments in reference to our NATO group, and I don't pretend to speak for them either. They're independent thinkers themselves. In fact, they're sitting here and they're sitting over here. And I'm sure they will holler out when they disagree with me, which is fine. That's the nature of our group. So I'm just going to jump right into my presentation. And just also note that I am from the University of Southern California, and that's not UCLA, that's USC, the Trojans, fight on. All right, so the crimson color, all right, not the light blue color. So it's the crimson color. So let me just jump in here. Here's the purpose of my presentation. I'm going to talk about the factors that we think are important around transition, but I'm also going to highlight some of our efforts as part of our research and technology group that I'm the chair of. And I also should say this here now because I think I didn't put it in the presentation. The vice chair of our NATO group is Dr. Durson, who's sitting second from the end on the panel. So she is just a fabulous vice chair and probably should be chair, but anyway, I'm taking the credit for her hard work in many respects and all the group. So here's my outline. For those of you who are aspiring to be military folks or present in a military style, you begin every presentation with an outline, kind of orients people to what you're going to talk about. Then I'll talk about it, and then at the end I'll tell you what I told you. So it's sort of tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. I don't know how that's coming across in the translation, by the way, but we'll see. All right, so first off, I am chair of the NATO group, and it's the Human Factors in Medicine panel, Research Technology Group 263, and the title is The Transition of Military Veterans from Active Service to Civilian Life. And it was approved in 2015. We will end next spring. And our two key deliverables will be a NATO report. Hopefully, folks will read it. We often talk about how NATO reports are the most often not read document. So we're going to do another often not read document, and that's an edited book. So we will also be delivering a scholarly book. We've already have a publisher lined up, so the chapters will come out, but in more detail in the NATO report. Here are the member nations. I'm not going to dwell on this, but we have seven NATO members. Here are our objectives. So our objective is to determine the current programs, policies, and process to support service members and their families transitioning from the military. And I will say families is a very, very small part of our NATO group. And really to address families properly, it needs its own group. But we do have one small effort within our group that is focused on families. It's developed guiding principles, so I will highlight some of those at the end, and also to document current research and lessons learned. So there's a lot of things we don't know, and this is where we think research is valuable from a NATO perspective on sort of addressing and covering down on these issues. And hopefully, when the Ukraine stands up their Departments of Veterans Affairs, they'll have a robust research component to it. I didn't see that explicitly stated in the org chart that was showed earlier, but I think that's really, really important to have research embedded in any organization around veteran issues. Our Department of Veterans Affairs does that. Many nations do that. Many don't do that, but I think one of the powerful things is how do you create a learning organization? And that's one way you do it, by encouraging research, experimentation, etc. So many people already have seen this slide that I've given to my American colleagues, but I think theory is really, really important in how you approach these problems. Most policymakers don't like theory. They think it's too ivory tower, and that it has no applicability. But I will tell you that a good theory, a good framework, it tells us what constructs we should be paying attention to. It also tells us, make predictions about the relationship between these things. So think about the Ukraine, you have combat operations going on. So how does combat and the experience of combat influence the transition back into civilian life? A good theory will help guide you in understanding those things and which things you should measure. And just as importantly, a good theory will identify points in which you can intervene, develop effective interventions, right, to help facilitate that transition. So I've developed my own theory. It's not important that it's my theory that I'm showing. There are other theories that are just as useful. This is the one that we have. But it basically says there are lots of transitions in the military. Entering is also just as important. We often don't talk about the entering the military as a transition, but that's a critical transition. And there's lots of transitions within the military. One of them being deploying to a combat zone, a combat area, coming out of the combat zone, going back into the combat zone, and then transitioning out of the military, okay, which is the one that we're focused on here today. But it's just important to appreciate there's lots of different types of transitions. And transitions offer opportunities for both growth and for problems to emerge. Oftentimes we focus on the problems because we want to help make things better for our service members, but we also must acknowledge that change and transitions is also an opportunity to grow and become better as a result of those experiences. So we should be thinking about this both from a positive aspect and then from a challenging aspect, not one or the other. Now, I show this slide. This is a slide that Simon Wesley still shows today, but he actually shows this in the US, so I've always reciprocated, and I show these same set of slides in the UK. And basically what it shows, if you look at the published literature and look at the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder amongst US, UK, and Canadian troops, you see that the US looks quite high compared to the UK and Canada. Right? Everyone see that? Everyone can see it looks like the US, something's going on there. Now, the next slide is what I call the Wesley's hypothesis. And he says it's because US service members are exaggerating their symptoms. Right? So, I have a torn fingernail and I need, a disability rating. The UK service members are better trained. That British, and they have better leaders. That the British character is superior to the US service members' character. If any of you know any Brits in the room, right? We know immediately that's not the case, right? If you're an American. So my hypothesis is, well, all of these things could be true. All right, all of these things could be true. And there's some evidence to suggest Wesley's hypothesis, except the last one about the superior character. But it's also true that it could be U.S. service members deploy longer, and that accounts for the difference. So on average, UK service members deploy to Afghanistan for about 6 months, U.S. deploy for a year, if you're in the Army, a little longer sometimes. U.S. service members experience higher levels of combat. Now that's related to the first point. So the longer you're in a combat environment, the more likely you are to be exposed to combat experiences and more of them. And then finally, there are some key demographic differences between the two populations, between the UK and the US. So to explore this, we established a US-UK joint agreement of where the data that was collected by Simon Wesley's group was merged with US data, of which I helped collect but was not part of this project. And when they merged the data and then looked at these variables, here's what emerged. So now you see that there's no difference between PTSD rates between US and UK when you control for these important demographic variables like deployment length, combat experience, and age. Okay, so age being an important one. However, if you look at increase in alcohol consumption, UK is different, right? You could see it's clearly higher. And it's elevated already above a very high alcohol consumption rate. And you can see aggression is also elevated, probably related to the increased alcohol consumption. The point here isn't that US service members are doing better, although clearly they look like they might be. The important point here is you have to be very careful when you just look at crude prevalence rates based on the published literature without carefully controlling for these other variables. But more importantly, because we had good theory to help us think about the important constructs to look at, it transcends culture, it transcends national militaries, and it transitions eras. So then you can actually use data from the US, the UK, Canada, other countries to inform, for example, what you should expect to see in Ukrainian forces when they return home. So you don't have to redo every single study to determine what are the important constructs and important variables to look at. You'll have a sense already based on what other people have done, what you need to be looking at. So within the military transition theory, and I think this is true of all theories that talk about military transition, there are these three things that you have to look at. You have to look at the military culture and the experiences of the service member. So were they engaged in combat, were they not? Did they encounter other traumas during their military service? What was their pre-existing conditions when they joined the military? So in the Ukrainian, I think the number that I remember is 4% of Ukrainians serve in the military. Did I get that number right? It's 4% roughly. So what decides which 4% serve? In the US, how do we know which 6 to 8% serve? Right? We know, for example, in the US that a disproportionate number of those who serve in the military come from disadvantaged backgrounds. This is true in most all-volunteer militaries, in which people who don't want to serve figure a clever way out of not serving, right? But then what motivates those to serve? And there's lots of motivation, so you have to understand that. I've already talked about transitions, but obviously you can't have a military transition theory if you're not talking about transitions. And then you have to be thinking about what are the important constructs. In military transition specifically, it's focused on health and well-being. So it's not just PTSD, it's not just the bad things, but it's also on the well-being aspect. Life satisfaction, employment, etc., and I'll talk about those. So here's what a successful transition looks like. So a successful transition includes a meaningful, well-paying job, strong relationships with family, friends, and community, and a sense of well-being and contentment. So if anybody has this, who served in the military, you'd say they transitioned pretty well. In fact, if people had this as an outcome, even if you never served in the military, you'd say you're doing pretty good, okay? So one of the important things here that I'll highlight is relationships are a central component of military transition, as is military identity, your personal identity, and I'll talk about that as well. So again, I've already talked about there are lots of types of transitions that one goes through. I'm going to focus here on those transitions that involve leaving the military, because that's the transition. People generally in society talk about two transitions that are important. One is returning home from combat, and the other one is leaving the military. But there's all these other transitions that are equally important that one needs to understand as well. It's important to understand the military as a culture. I'm not going to go through every one of these bullets that highlight how military culture can differ, and in many cases does differ, from civilian culture, but I do want to highlight the one about the unique military identity. In the U.S. in particular, and maybe it's a unique case in this sense, is the U.S. military goes out of its way as part of the entering the military, the indoctrination component, to instill this idea that by serving in the military, you are a unique and special individual, deserving of unique and special acknowledgement and recognition. Other countries do this to varying degrees. Perhaps the U.S. does it probably to the most extreme degree. But this has in a very important component when you leave the military, if you have this sense of identity that makes you this special and unique person. Oh, and probably I should also note, so everyone thinks about the hierarchy, blah, blah, blah. But it's also important to note that the military is collective socialism. And in the U.S., socialism is a bad thing, right? Socialism is bad, capitalism is good. But this is important because if all you've known your entire life is this collective socialist approach, then you will struggle when you transition to civilian society where it's capitalistic driven. So there's two great socialist systems in America. I've just mentioned one, the military. The other one is the family, right? So if you are in the Castro family, all of my kids eat, have a room. I have to provide them food and clothing, regardless of their ability to contribute to my household income, right? In fact, there's laws that say I must do so until age 18. So this is important because if you go from your family, which most service members do, which is a socialist system, into the military, which is a socialist system, all you've known your entire life is socialism. So there are about 65,000 sergeants in the U.S. Army. That's bigger than most people's militaries. If you're number 1 or number 65,000, you get the same pay and benefits. There's no difference. That's not capitalism, that's socialism. Okay, so it's important to understand that. And when service members leave, sometimes they have difficulty getting their head around that concept because of the value-based organization that most militaries espouse. However, there are many positive aspects of military service. I won't go through all of these, but these things are also part of the culture. So these are things that service members get, and one of them is sort of this sense of mission, this sense of accomplishment, the sense of service. In many respects, and veterans in the U.S. and actually around the world talk about this, that their highlight of their entire life was that 2 or 3 year period, maybe a little longer, in which they served in the military. So everything else will then be referenced to the accomplishments and the contributions that they made while they were in the military. And they will look to sort of replicate that accomplishment. So what are they going to do in their next phase as they leave the military? So these are also some very important facts to remember. Most veterans transition fine, okay? We tend to focus on that 10 to 20% that struggle, but we must keep in mind that most transition okay. And a lot of veterans want to be left alone. So I'm one of those veterans that like to be left alone. Okay, so I don't like to raise my hand when they say, "Are you a veteran?" I don't like to stand up and be acknowledged. I don't like people telling me to stand up to be acknowledged, okay? So I like to be left alone. And I think that's an American right to be left alone. It's an American right to refuse services that would benefit us. That's our right to do that. And as folks interested in helping veterans, we must recognize that right to be left alone. Now, not all nations have a Veterans Administration. Most nations do not have a Veterans Administration. I think the Ukrainians know this better than anybody else because they're going to create one. But most don't. Does that mean that if you have a Veterans Administration that veterans do better? I'm unaware of any data that supports that assertion. I'd like to think they do better if you have someone who's supposed to be focused on taking care of them. But I'm unaware of any studies that actually show that. Another thing is the definition of a veteran varies from nation to nation. Oftentimes when we use the word veteran, we think we're talking about the same group of people, and we're not. In the US, we have a very complicated, I think every country ultimately gets to a complicated definition of a veteran because of the bureaucracy. And why is definition even important in this context? It's important because it determines who gets benefits, who gets support, who gets services. Who doesn't get benefits, who doesn't get services, you can say it the other way. So it's really important that people understand, when you say a veteran, what are you talking about? I think without a doubt, the UK has the most inclusive definition of a veteran that exists. And that is, you serve 24 hours, 1 day, in uniform, you're a veteran. I don't know of any other country, I think Canada is thinking of adopting that definition, but I don't think any other country has that inclusive of a definition. Most definitions of veterans are exclusive. Who can we exclude from the population? Okay, so it's not how can we be inclusive, it's how can we exclude people. Now, I'm not saying folks in the room here are doing that, but there's somebody, and I always like to think they're in the basement, because people who do this kind of analysis shouldn't have a window, but they're crunching numbers to see how much is it going to cost to take care of veterans. And I always like to think they're in the basement. They probably actually, they'll have the best office in the building who are doing this. But things cost money, and we'll talk about that. Families and communities are often forgotten in the discussion. You heard John earlier specifically talk about families. I think the approach that the Ukraine is taking towards families is spot on, but they are often excluded. And communities are often excluded, but they're such an important partner in the whole transition. They shouldn't be excluded, and they shouldn't be thought about after the fact and kind of they should be an integral part of the plan. They need to be an integral part of the plan in order for a service member to transition back to civilian life successfully. And whether you do that systematically and methodically or whether it just happen chance, it's still a really important piece. And the larger the community, the more difficult it actually will be, because there's more organizations and agencies that have to be coordinated. So it's not easy. It's why they're often excluded, but they're an important part to include. So who's a veteran? So I put this slide up. So these people here, a sergeant major who retired after serving 25 years in the Army, a Marine Corps Staff Sergeant who served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, and a homeless woman who left the military after 20 months. So I say, are these veterans? And the only country I know of is the UK who could say yes to all 3 of these. Every other country, to include the yes, would be, it depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on their discharge status. It depends on if it was a medical discharge. It depends on did they deploy to an operation or not. So all of these, it depends. But I will tell you, for a civilian, if I showed these same definitions or these same questions to my wife or any civilian who never served, they'd say, oh yeah, those are all veterans. But they may not be because of how we define who's a veteran. So it's really important. Do we want to include these people or do we want to exclude them? So, you know, veteran benefits and support. So how a veteran is defined, I already mentioned determines benefit. How their service will be recognized by society is important. So if you have a criteria, and most countries do, that in order to be a veteran, you have to have gone on or participated in a military operation. Most countries have that definition. So you could serve, and if you've never deployed anywhere or did anything, technically you're not a veteran. If you're in the U.S., you're a National Guard and reservist, and you were never activated for federal service, and you served 20, 30 years in the National Guard, you would, by definition, not be a veteran. Now, you think, well, does that make sense? From my perspective as a veteran, I say that makes no sense, but these are important distinctions. And also how society then honors them. And then how the veteran will be viewed, the meaning of their service. So if I say you're not a veteran, even though you've served in uniform for 25 years, what does that mean? Does it mean I've just wasted my time? What does it mean when you lose that status? And then how the military family will be treated and supported will also be determined by whether or not the service member is called a veteran. So when you saw the definition that Ukraine's had, the family status is tied to the veteran status, right? I'm unaware of any nation that has a military family status that's independent of the service member status. And I've talked to my colleagues about how can we decouple them, and nobody has really figured that out, but that's a really tough one. It's why it needs its own group to kind of, I think, sort through those issues. I like to get people to think about a veteran as an immigrant when it comes to supporting their transition out of the military. So if you think, okay, I'm moving to India, me and my whole family are moving. What are those things that I would have to think about? Well, I'd have to think about where am I going to work? Where am I going to live? Where are my kids going to go to school? Where am I going to shop? Where am I going to do my finances and legal issues? All of these issues and many more is exactly what a service member leaving the military has to figure out for themselves. Because they're now leaving this socialist system where all of that's taken care of for them, to where, no, you got to sort it out for yourself. You've got to compete with everybody else for that nice apartment you want, for that great paying job. All of this has to be sorted out. So this is the challenge. This is the challenge that we have when we try to support veterans as they transition out of the military back into civilian life. So we think that the approach that should be taken is this sort of comprehensive approach, this biopsychosocial, spiritual, financial health model. So these kind of 5 key domains. But I will tell you, employment is absolutely critical. Employment is absolutely critical. It's more important than health. Because we know that if you have any health issues, physical or mental, the best intervention for dealing with those issues is having a job. Having a job helps you with your pain management. Having a job helps you with your mental health. It's just very, very positive to have it. I can't think of a negative thing about having a job other than maybe you have a supervisor who's a real jerk, and that then could be kind of a counter. There's evidence to suggest having a toxic supervisor or toxic leader could be bad for your health. But other than that, having a job is a pretty powerful thing. And I always tell folks, when the U.S. spends a lot of money on the homeless population, the veteran homeless population. But I will tell you, the problem with a homeless veteran isn't they just don't have a place to live. They usually have no job, health issues, financial issues, legal issues, addiction issues, all the above, okay? So, but if you have a job, it's hard to have all of these bad behaviors because you can't keep a job if you're doing that. So having a job is very positive. Now, When we're feeling in a good mood, we'd say having a well-paying job, and then we'd say having a well-paying job you like, that you're deriving meaning from. So this is kind of a hierarchical approach to employment. I'm just giving you sort of the simple, but if you don't have a job, you're going to be in trouble. Now, a lot of focus is spent on PTSD, depression, suicidality, or suicides in the military. And people often think about these things, and this is just some data that we've collected. This is in no way to say this is the magnitude of the problem, but it's important to understand that having post-traumatic stress disorder, having depression, having physical health issues will impact the transition process. And so this is why we attend to it. And plus, there's often suffering associated with these mental health conditions. These are not the only mental health conditions veterans have, by the way, but these are the most prominent mental health conditions. But it's important that if they do have these issues, that we try to get them care sooner versus later. Okay, sooner versus later. And then we get into the issue of stigma around mental health issues. And in the military, there's also a very large stigma around physical health issues as well that we never talk about. I rarely hear anybody talking about the stigma associated with having physical health issues. But there's also a stigma in the military around physical health. It's not as high as mental health issues, but it's not insignificant either. And what we know is when we look at the data, that 25% of all suicides in the U.S. military occurred during the first 2 years of military service. So what does that mean? That's the transition into the military, right? So this is a very stressful time. And you have 25% of all suicides in the U.S. military occurring within the first 2 years of military service, before they've deployed anywhere. So it's not like they were brought on active duty and deployed and they came back. This is before they've deployed anywhere. Half of all suicides in the Army occur within 6 months of returning home from a deployment. Again, a transition. And then the highest rates of suicides among military veterans in the U.S. occurs during the first 2 years of leaving the military. Again, a transition point. And what's happening in all of these transition points? Disruptions in relationships, disruptions in support, okay? And I'm told when I talk to other countries, yeah, we see the same thing around these key time points when things go bad. But this then tells us this is where we should build our interventions, and I'll make that point again. So sexual harassment and sexual assaults are very prevalent in the U.S. military, and I will say this, the data that I've looked at, it's prevalent in every military in which women serve. And in fact, sexual assaults are also very prevalent in college undergraduates. And the EU did a very large study about 5 years ago around sexual assaults amongst their member nations. And they're right in line with what you see in the U.S. college population, the U.S. in general, et cetera. So I highlight this because a lot of people think, oh, well, sexual assaults is just a military problem. I will tell you, it's a national problem in the U.S., and it's a global problem. It's a global problem. And oftentimes we don't collect data on this because, quite honestly, who wants to deal with this? But I will tell you that the U.S. military, I think, is leading the world in assessing for the prevalence of sexual assault within the military and really working hard to minimize it and reduce it. But this is a tough challenge because I think it's culturally embedded. But having said that, we know from data that the U.S. military has collected that 85% of all sexual assaults involving our women service members occur within the first 2 years of military service. Again, that transition into the military. So if you were going to develop a sexual assault prevention program, where would you focus your efforts? When women join the military. You wouldn't wait till they've been in 10 years and then start. Right? And we know in our college undergraduates in the U.S. that sexual assaults occur within the first 6 months of moving away to college. Okay? Again, they don't know who to trust. Their relationships have been disrupted. So again, we think this is a place to intervene. So again, just very briefly, military identity is emerging as a really, really important element around transition. And I've already mentioned that military identity is fostered, deliberately fostered. And it's fostered, and there are differences in the U.S. among services. I think the Marine Corps probably does the best job of fostering a Marine Corps identity than do the other services. But they all, to some degree, foster this military veteran identity. And it's important when you move from one culture to another, your identity. In the States, for example, in Los Angeles, we have a Chinatown. We have a Korean town. We have a place where the Armenians live. Why is that? Well, people like being around people like themselves because it helps them maintain their cultural identity. And veterans do the same thing by joining veteran organizations or seeking out other veterans. So this is a very natural response to maintain part of this identity you have when you move from one culture to another culture. Now, in the work that we've done, identity is not a unidimensional construct. In our research, we've found 7 different distinct dimensions around identity, all very differently related to outcomes. So this is a cross-sectional study, so I don't have arrows drawn on this because I'm not inferring causality because they're correlations, but these are things that you would generally expect. So if you feel committed, the longer you serve, the more you feel committed to the military, the more the military becomes central to who you are in terms of your identity. How the public perceives the military is very important. So how does the military treat veterans? You say, yeah, you're not special. Or do they say, no, you are special. You're one of the 4 or 5% who served. Or are you like Israel where everybody serves so nobody's special? Okay, because it has its drawbacks. Oftentimes in the U.S., we talk about having universal conscripted service. But if you do that, I think the military will lose its special place. If everybody serves, then nobody's special. The only thing that makes veterans special in America is only a tiny % actually serve. And we also know that if you view the military as a family, all of these things go up the longer you serve. We also know, but only 2 of these are related to deployments. So you're more committed to the military, and you are more likely to see the military as a family. And that increases as you repeat the number of deployments you go on. However, these things can be related to post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So and I'll just highlight one, so if the public isn't supportive of their veteran population, they are more likely to screen positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. So this shows an example of where society, the community's view of veterans can influence a mental health outcome. And obviously it's also related to depression and suicidality in very much the same way. I threw this slide in here just to show you that it's also related to physical health symptoms, not just mental health. Again, you really cannot just look at mental health in isolation of physical health because all the research shows that these 2 things are intertwined. So when you talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and you talk about suicidality, immediately you should be thinking, what are the physical health symptoms that might also be associated with those mental health issues, and vice versa. If somebody comes in with a bad back and a bad knee, you should be thinking, okay, let me also check for mental health issues as well. Because I may come in to have my back looked at, but not come in and have my mental health looked at, okay? Because of the stigma I talked about earlier. Difficulty adjusting. So all of this leads to this relationship for adjusting back to civilian life. Now, as I mentioned, these data are all correlational, but it now tells us we can start looking at longitudinal studies that look at what came first. What are these longitudinal relationships, because this could be a point of intervention around identity and help people sort of assimilate and adjust back to civilian life in a systematic way. But it's not simply get rid of your military identity, it's how do you adapt your military identity and incorporate that identity into your new civilian life. So, one of the things that I mentioned is that we're going to have a scholarly book that's coming out. These are the tentative titles and the lead authors, and I was looking at this this morning. I think I got some of this wrong because I didn't actually have Sonella look at it first, which I probably should have. But anyway, this is provided to you really for your information to see the types of topics that we're addressing, and it's the ones that I've just mentioned. But we're also taking a look at measurements of outcomes and quantifiable outcomes. And we really do take this evidence-based approach. So I've already kind of beat this point up, but understanding transitions and what happens in these transition phases will help us know what interventions we need and when do we need them. So this is, again, the importance of theory and understanding when can things go wrong, and when do they go wrong? And it's generally around these transition points. And it's also important to leverage what others are already doing that works. Now, oftentimes people do things. More often than not, probably 98% of the time, people do things in terms of interventions, and they don't know if they're working or not. They think they're working, but if you say, well, show me the evidence that it's working, they'll struggle. They'll struggle to do that. So we really emphasize the importance of doing that. So I'll end with this slide here, that these are some of the emerging recommendations from our NATO group. And I say they're emerging because, in fairness, I didn't show the NATO group that these are the emerging recommendations. But these, I think, are fair in terms of, so we think we should develop a definition of who's a veteran that's inclusive. Now, inclusive is subjective because you may think, well, going on operational deployment's inclusive. But the idea is it needs to be inclusive. We think that it's helpful and beneficial to foster a national culture that respects military service. This is particularly important if you have an all-volunteer military, because if the military's job is to defend the country, I would think you'd want the best people your nation has being part of that responsibility, and not the people who are, quote, expendable. Now, oftentimes, that's who joins the military, but I think we need to move beyond that. We need to accept that it's expensive having a military, and it's expensive taking care of veterans who've served in the military. This isn't a cost-neutral concept, and oftentimes this is what drives our definitions. Who gets the benefit, who doesn't get the benefit, what kind of benefits are we going to provide? This will all be determined by budgets. I will say that in the US, we probably have, without me having done any real analysis, one of the most generous sets of programs for veterans anywhere on the planet. And our healthcare system for veterans, if you're a veteran, by definition, the definition veteran, is extremely state-of-the-art, extremely expensive, but it's extremely state-of-the-art. If you get health care in our healthcare system in the VA, you will have state-of-the-art care. There's no question in my mind about that. If you serve in our military, you will have the best healthcare system in the world, period. I think any metric that I could develop would show that the active duty healthcare system in our military is top-notch in terms of quality of position, etc. No price is not an option. We also have to recognize that transitions offer an opportunity to deliver evidence-based care. And evidence-based care, evidence-based interventions are the critical components there. Because there's developing programs and implementing them that actually don't do anything are very, very expensive. And they're also then very, very hard to stop. Because once someone starts a program, most politicians are reluctant to end the program. because they'll be thought of, you don't really care, you're doing this great program, even though the other judge doesn't do anything. So this is why you invest in all of these analysis up front, so you know it's going to achieve something, and then you assess to make sure that it is achieving those outcomes that you want it to achieve. And then, if it's not, then you can adjust the program. But if you're not collecting the data to assess the effectiveness, then you really are wasting money and resources. And I would tell you the U.S. wastes a lot of money and resources because most of our programs also are evaluated. Some are, a lot are not. We need also to support ongoing research. So this is the researcher in me, but there are a lot of things we just still don't know. And the only way we will know those things is by doing systematic research. I took out that's theory-based, but I do think research should be theory-based. I started off that way, but it's probably not going to be one of our emerging recommendations, I don't think. But who knows, maybe it will be. And then we think you need to adopt a holistic life course approach. So holistic means don't just focus on mental health. Don't just focus on health, because health is only one small part of this veteran as an immigrant metaphor that I used, right? There's employment, there's housing, there's identity. Okay, we need a holistic approach, and we need to think about it from a life course perspective. One of the things we know, for example, in the U.S., is that when a veteran leaves the military, they will have multiple jobs, sometimes 5, 6 jobs within the first 2 years of leaving the military. So why is that? Well, they're trying to figure out what they want to do, what interests them, how they can connect to their job. And oftentimes that takes repetitive, nope, that doesn't work, nope, nope, okay, I like this job, all right? So a transition is a process that occurs throughout the entire life. And also, again, we shouldn't forget the family in those discussions. So that's all I have. Here's the point of contact. So if you really liked what I said, I'd love to hear from you. If you didn't like what I said, please email Sanella Durson down here on the end with any complaints. But just a minor plug, I'm also the editor of the Military Behavioral Health Journal. So if any of you would like to submit an article, I'm the editor. See me later, I'll give you my card so I'll know to look out. I can use my influence as the editor to sort of guide you to a successful publication if you're interested in doing that. So thank you very much, and that concludes my talk.